Devarim, Perek Vav, the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. V'zot ha-mitzvah chukim v'mishpatim asher tzivah Adonai Elohechem lamedechem la'asot ba'aretz asher atem ovrim shama l'rishta. These are the instructions, the laws, the rules that God has commanded me to impart to you, that you need to observe in the land that you're about to cross into. The mantirat Adonai Elohecha, so that you revere God. L'shmor kol chukotav u'mitzvotav asher anochi mitzaveka ata uvincha uven bincha kol yemei chayecha uleman yarichon yomecha. So that your children and your children's children, right? He says sons and grandsons, sons and daughters and granddaughters, but it means for all time. That you revere God and follow God as long as you live. All of the divine laws and commandments that I've taught to you. V'shamata Yisrael, v'shamarta la'asot asher yitab lecha, asher tirbun ma'od, kasher diber Adonai Elohei avotecha lach eretz zavat chalav udvash. And you should listen, Israel, and you should follow the commandments faithfully, and it will be to your benefit. This is one of the themes of the last number of chapters, the idea that the mitzvot are to the benefit of Bnei Yisrael. We mentioned it the other day, that the nations are going to look and say, wow, look at these people, look at the civilization who has a just law, look at their wisdom, look at their brilliance. And so it's for your good, and it's so that you and your ancestors will increase and grow in the land flowing with milk and honey in the Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. Now we continue in verse 4 with part of the Torah that everybody generally knows. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Hashem is our God. Hashem alone. Hashem is one. Obviously, different ways of understanding that verse, the cardinal belief and idea in Jewish life of monotheism, right? We had earlier in the last chapter, we had Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And almost as an extension, drawing from there, we understand that there's an idea that God is one. That's what the Aseret HaDibrot told us, or that there is this God who is present in history. And Moshe then says that therefore it should cause what we see now in verse 5. There is this God who took us out of Egypt, who has been kind to us, who's going to give us the land of Israel, who fights battles and wars for us, who heals us when we're sick, etc., etc. And therefore you should love your God, and you should love your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. These last 3 phrases, we saw some of this language the other day. We're going to have it further. This is the Devarim language of the way that you love God. The rabbis, of course, come and they try to understand what each phrase means. So you have to love God with me'odecha as all your money. You have to love God be willing to give nafshecha. You have to be willing to give up your life for God. This was the verse that Rabbi Akiva used in stating that when he was martyred by the Romans, and he said, my whole life I wondered whether or not I could fulfill this verse, and now I've been given this opportunity to fulfill this idea of loving God with everything that I have. Now, the love of God, much in Jewish life, not surprisingly, it comes along with, it's not just, to say I love you, but it's very much about action. It's very much about doing things. And thus, V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela, continuing in verse 6, Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha. These things need to be right on your heart, meaning they need to be close to you. Vishinantam levanecha, you have to teach them to your children. V'dibartabam, and this is what you should be speaking about. All your speech shouldn't be about the queen and the succession. You have to speak about the Torah. You have to speak about God. You have to speak about all the greatness we have in our lives because of God. V'shivtecha v'veitecha v'lechtecha v'aderech v'shachlecha v'kumecha. When you're at home and when you're on your way, when you lie down and when you get up. The rabbis look at this verse from a halachic perspective and understand that these are related to different ways that you say Shema. You can say Shema when you're sitting, you say Shema when you're standing. It has to be in the morning, the time of getting up, and in the evening at the time of going to sleep. But it's so speaking these words, having them be live, having them be really part of your life. And then verse 8, they should be a sign on your hand and as a symbol on your forehead. That's, of course, related to the idea of that's where one of the verses where we derive the idea of tefillin on your arm and on your head, right? And there's an idea on your head is thought, and on your arm is action, right? Your loving God is thought, but it has to be directed to action. It's not, oh, I love you, but I'm not doing anything for you. Judaism is not just a religion of faith, of belief, but it's a religion of action, of doing. And inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and your gates. Obviously, the mitzvah of mezuzah. So here we have sort of the extension of the Aseret HaDibrot. How do we take this idea that God took us out of Egypt and that we know there's a God, and how do we go and we put that into the reality of life? How will this idea dictate actions? Because what God has provided for us, we should love God and we should do these things. And now Moshe continues, verse 10, Arim dolot v'tovot asher lo vanita. When God brings you into the land that God has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, these large, flourishing cities which you did not build. Uvatim leim kol tuv asher lo mileta, and houses that are filled with the best appliances and the nicest closets and the updated bathrooms. Uvarot chatzuvim asher lo chatzavta, and cisterns that you didn't use. V'zeitim asher lo natata, and olive groves that you did not plant. V'achalta v'savata, and you will eat, and you will be full. You will be satiated, right? And it's not anything that you did. It's one thing if you say, I worked hard by my sweat, and I planted vineyards, and now look at all the grapes that I have. Look at this, is God is providing for you. Hishamer lecha pentishkach et Adonai. Right? You're going to be sitting there in a nice house. You're going to be sitting there full of food. You'll have all that you want in your life. And just be careful. Don't forget God who took you out of Egypt. And to me, this is always, I say, the most important. Why did God have to put us in Egypt? Why does that have to be our governing story as Jews? And to me, the whole idea is we need to remember, as we're sitting in the lap of luxury, where we have everything, where we feel that we're lacking nothing, that we're not far removed from being slaves. These are who our ancestors were, and sadly, it could be who we are in the future. You might be on top of the world today, tomorrow you could be on the bottom of the barrel. And so we need to remember that so we don't get too haughty, we don't get too arrogant, we remain thankful, remain appreciative of what we do. And Moshe says here, he's worried that that's what's going to happen to the people. They're going to forget God. They're just going to think that it's because of them, but God is the one who put them in this position. And thus verse 13, revere your God, worship God alone, and swear only by God's name. Don't worship the idols from the nations that surround you. Because the zealous, the impassioned God is in your midst. Lest God get angry and his anger blaze forth and wipes you off of the earth. So Moshe here is worried about what's going to happen when Bnei Israel have everything in the land of Israel. Lo tinasu et Adonai Elohechem. Do not test your God, kasher nisitem b'masa, as you did in Masa and in many other places in the desert where you tested God, you challenged God, you disagreed with God. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. Shamor tishmerun et mitzvot Adonai Elohechem ve'edutav v'chukav asher tzivach. Keep God's commandments, God's decrees, God's laws, all the things that God that have been given to you as commandments. And do what is right and good in the sight of God. And the Ramban and others look at these verses as being some going above the letter of the law, doing even more. It's not just doing the mitzvot, but you have to go and do what's yashar. You have to do what's right. You have to do what's tov. You have to do what's good. So you have to go even beyond what God has simply said to us. It's related to his comment in many ways that he says back in the book of Vayikra, and Kedoshim to you, not to be a Naval, B'Reshut HaTorah. Technically, I'm keeping the mitzvot, but I'm a glutton, I'm a bad person. So here as well, right? You have to look, you have to do that which is right, even beyond. And why should we do this? Why that all will be well for you and you're able to possess the great land that God has promised to our ancestors. And that all our enemies should be driven out as God has spoken. Continue now in verse 20. We get to it's where it's Pesach now. When your child will ask you in the future, what are these decrees and laws and rules that our God has commanded you? And you should say to your son, Abadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. You should say to your children, we were slaves in Egypt. Vayotzianu Adonai miMitzrayim biyad chazakah. And God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. Vayitein Adonai otot umoftim gdolim v'ra'im b'Mitzrayim b'Faro uv'chol beito le'einenu. And God, right, we saw the marvels, the destruction, all of the wonders and miracles that God performed against the Egyptians, against Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians. Votanu totzini sham, and God extracted us, took us out from there and freed us. Laman heviotanu latet lanu et haaretz asher nishbah la'avotenu, in order to give us the land that was promised to our ancestors. Vayitzavenu Adonai lasot kol chakim ha'ela, and God has commanded us to perform these mitzvot, liyirat Adonai Eloheinu latov lanu kol hayamim lachiotenu kayom hazeh. God has commanded us to observe these mitzvot, to revere God, and that's for our good. That is for us, right? If you have a good society, you have a good civilization, you have a good, then your society is going to prosper more. Utzdakat yelan, and it will be a merit to us. It will give us, we will be the ones, it will be helpful to us, ki nishmor la'asot et kol ha'mitzvah hazot, that we can observe these commandments faithfully, lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, ka'asher tzivanu, as God has instructed us, as God has commanded us to do. And so the theme that we've had here of following the mitzvot, which Moshe over and over again is telling them not to forget God. You're going to go into the land of Israel. You're not going to be living right next to the Mishkan, is right a theme of the book of Devarim. And therefore, the idea that comes out of it, thus, you need to have tefillin, you need to have mezuzot, you need to have ways that God is close to you, because it's much easier to forget God when you're enjoying the bounty of your harvest and you're not 150 feet away from Mishkan. You're not, a mile away from the holy city. And so we're told here, Moshe is again stressing to the Jewish people in this chapter and in this book, what he's trying to tell them and to teach them is it's going to get easy to forget God. But we have to remember God, and our religion is one, not just of faith, but we have to understand very, very much that God has to be present in our lives, and we have to do things actively to ensure that that happens. And that's how we should live our lives personally. And that's also how we need to go and build just communities.